Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, May 27th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are actually not broadcasting live today. We are pre-recorded. It is Memorial Day, and in fact, we do not have a new show for you. But we wanted to leave you with something. We have a deep cut. This is from 2010, when I was no longer at Air America, but still had a studio. And I did 1 or 2 spots on the TYT network. And this is just a brief snippet of one of those shows, but an interview with Chris Hayes. This is back in 2010. It was centered around the frustration with the Obama administration, and then more broadly, the structural problems. Hopefully we are faced with this same situation again soon, and Democrats react in a different way, but we will see. But I had stumbled across it. I found it interesting. I thought it might be something. Generally, we just do nothing on Memorial Day, but we're gonna post this for you folks, special. So, with that said, I want to wish you a happy Memorial Day. I don't really know that we should be necessarily happy, but I have a good day off. It is a holiday that is meant to remember and honor people who died while serving in the U.S. military. And look, the bottom line is that the civilian leadership in this country has far too often sent people to go and kill other people and to die themselves. And so, for those of us who are not in the military, we have a responsibility to make sure that our civilian leadership genuinely honors these people's lives and their sacrifices before they're made. And also understand, obviously, the humanity of people who we would send these people, our military, to go kill. So hopefully Memorial Day should function at the very least to remind people that in the vast majority of instances, war is not the answer. There are times where I think it's necessary, but less and less so in this day and age, frankly. So hopefully we will have a civilian leadership that will actually genuinely honor the lives of both the military and those they are meant to be used against. So let's cut our defense budget instead of expanding it for the second year in a row, and appreciate our vets, fund their healing, and maybe send them off, active military off less to need healing. All right. In the meantime, here is an interview from 2010 I did with Chris Hayes on his piece "System Failure" in The Nation magazine. You can find it, I think, if you just Google "System Failure Nation magazine" from 2010. All right. We'll be back live on Tuesday.
On the phone
And, after we talk to Chris Hayes, we'll talk a little bit more about, the frustration that I know many of you are feeling, and certainly I'm feeling with Obama and the Democrats in general. But Chris Hayes is on the phone. He has written, and I have a link to it at samsedershow.com. I've linked to the story. It's called System Failure. It was, I guess it's now a month old, nearly, in The Nation. It is a great piece. Chris, are you there?
I am here, and I apologize for the racket. I'm caught in a Hobbesian nightmare of a supermarket in Washington, D.C. on the eve of our big snowstorm.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I understand you guys are going to get snowed in, so don't let me prevent you from getting your supplies, your needed supplies. Which,
provisions for 7-layer taco dip, very necessary going into Super Bowl weekend.
And do you hit the liquor store before or after?
I'm going to try to hit it after, but I've now been in this line so long, I don't even know how much stamina I have left in me.
Well, it sounds fine on this end. We're doing this show together today with basically gum and duct tape, so that's fine. And
radio style.
Exactly. And I want to talk about this piece. I read this piece 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's a fantastic piece, and I think, one of the, over the years, we've had the opportunity to talk many times, and one of the things that I love about your writing and where you fit in the ecosystem of the liberal thinkers, you I think, get this dynamic of insider-outsider more than I think any writer who is genuinely accepted by both insiders and outsiders.
That's funny you say that, because I think I do sort of, particularly since I moved to D.C. and taken this role here where I'm much more, around the inside, that I see myself as kind of mediating between the two in a lot of ways. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, I grew up in a household in which my father was a community organizer, and some of my earliest memories, one of my earliest memories is a big march through the South Bronx when they were doing, demanding actually more police attention during the kind of high point of the crack epidemic in New York, and being in neighborhoods where they're doing bank protests and stuff like that. So I just, grew up around organizing and have just tremendous admiration and respect for the work that, organizers and activists do.
Yeah, and I really think that you're an incredibly important voice in that way, because you really do influence. And I'm not even talking. This is not and I think the key to your story here, the system failure that I think is so important, is that we're having this conversation not in the context of a left-right divide.
Right.
We're having this conversation within the context of a divide that I don't think gets really enough attention, and it's a insider-outsider, populist versus establishment type of dynamic.
That's right, and what's so fascinating at this moment, at this sort of particular juncture in the American political life, in American social life generally, is we're really dealing with this moment where there is this kind of profound crisis of authority in the country. And it's something that I don't think that the people who are kind of occupy positions of authority, people who are kind of in the establishment, broadly construed, really recognize enough. And I think that it is in some ways a kind of defining characteristic of our politics, where the healthcare bill is a perfect example. I mean, the people who like the healthcare bill the most are healthcare wonks. I mean, and these are good, and I mean that, I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean that in these are really good, very smart people who have spent years studying this stuff and getting into the nitty-gritty, and yet we've ended up with a bill whose only constituency seems to be healthcare wonks, right?
Right.
That's exactly kind of that is, sums up the problem we have. And I think that one of the things you're seeing on the left in this insider-outsider dynamic is that the crisis of authority does cross across party and ideological lines, to the point where the more populist left is saying, I'm not quite sure if I trust the healthcare wonks, right?
Right. Well, let's back up a little bit. Because I want to put this in general, because you basically say we're facing these two problems, And one is the sort of the human economic practical problems that we're facing, the wars, the healthcare, unemployment, immigration, global warming, and then you say the second problem that we're facing is a systemic problem where power is being concentrated, and in some respects, we're headed down the road to oligarchy.
Yeah.
And then you get into the healthcare where, like you say, it's the wonks that really appreciate this bill. But the real problem here is that on one hand, while it addresses some of those human problems, pre-existing conditions, it gives healthcare for millions who don't have it. It's basically a bribe to the insurance industries to do well. It exacerbates the second problem, which is this road to oligarchy.
Right, and that's the central paradox that that all the way that power is consolidated, the way Washington functions, and the strength of the oligarchy sets up constantly these kinds of Sophie's choices, where you're the only way you can make progress on the human level, and that progress on the human level is real, right? I mean, it's not abstract. Like, people will get health insurance, will help people, Medicaid will expand, but the only way to do it is essentially to bribe off the oligarchs and to further entrench their power. And I compare in the essay to, if you were a social worker in a poor neighborhood that was where the small business people were essentially having to pay a protection fee to a protection racket, right? And you were poised in such a way where you could raise enough money that you could make up the difference for those members of a small business that couldn't pay, and you could sort of subsidize their payment, and it would be a profound improvement in their life. But at the same time, you're further entrenching the protection racket, and that, I think, is the kind of central policy dilemma we're constantly facing here.
Right, and this, that I think is why you see so many on the left upset about this bill, because it doesn't seem to deal with the larger problem. I mean, I guess this is a very sort of scary place to be in, because as someone who I voted for Nader in 2000. Now, to be fair to myself, I did it vote swap with somebody in Florida. And I'm not sure I would have done that necessarily, but I certainly felt in 2000 that this road to oligarchy, which has become far more pronounced, obviously, and I certainly, if I was in a contested state, would not have voted for Nader. I doubt then, but certainly not now, in retrospect. But is this the bigger problem? I mean, that's really what it comes down to, and even in the context of your story, I think that you're caught in that dilemma as well, because you do say that you support this Medicare bill, and I think at the end of the day, I do too. Certainly at 59. But what you say at the end, and this is what's so fascinating to me about this. At the end, you say, what the country needs more than higher growth and lower unemployment, greater income equality, a new energy economy, and drastically reduced carbon emissions is a redistribution of power, a society-wide epidemic of redemocratization. And that's really what the argument is. It's that sort of a calculus that I think is bedeviling the left right now, to the extent that there's a left in America.
No, I think that's right. And I think it's a choice between these kind of, one way to look at it, one sort of is substance and process, right? So you plunge ahead on these kind of substantive grounds, knowing that the game is corrupt and it's rigged and there's all these players that you have to bribe off? Or do you say we need to do things that, change the rules of the game? And there's some small stuff, like we should get rid of the filibuster. There's larger stuff, like we should have public elections. Then there's other things like, Employee Free Choice Act or immigration reform that would actually take people out of legal limbo and give them the power of citizenship. There's 12 million people out there that are, now that's not a processy thing. That's then something that's actually on the table substantively that we actually might be able to get. But if you were thinking in terms of power, those things would be higher on the priority list, right? If you were thinking in terms of how do we redistribute power, something like Employee Free Choice Act that would give greater empowerment to workers, something like getting 12 million people, out of legal limbo, conferring on them both the power and responsibility of citizenship, that redistributes power, that draws power down and out. And, those things have been, all the things that sort of would alter the power relationships have been basically put on the back burner while pursuing these kind of big substantive agenda. And I don't even, I guess I'm second guessing that at a certain point, but it's not like it's a crazy thing for the administration to have done. It's just that I think we're seeing the limitations of it, which is that the corruption is so embedded, the power is so concentrated that, it may be at the end of the day you can't get this stuff passed. You can't get good progressive legislation through until you deal with this deeper power issue.
Right. Well, I guess that may be the lesson here. It's less an issue of it's less of a choice that we're making, but this is the cards that were dealt, and this is the way that societies have. I don't know if our society is capable of having a revolution or some type of upheaval. I mean,
look. One of the things I think is one of the things that Obama got right in his campaigning was when he pointed to these historical moments of reform. I mean, in 1907, when J.P. Morgan basically rides into Lower Manhattan and bails out, by himself, basically rescues the U.S. and also probably the globe to a certain extent from a financial panic, right? And at that point, there's about 6 men who own, who control about 60 to 70% of the capital in the entire economy. At that point, it seemed inconceivable that, the progressive era and the sort of, the trust breaking up would happen and that you would get this sort of small business economy that flourished later on, right? And it's the same thing when you look at the 20s and compare that, the amount of power that the sort of banks had in the 20s to what happened to them during the New Deal. I mean, there have been moments before where it looks similarly like the nation had passed this tipping point of oligarchy, and at each point it has managed to kind of wrench itself back. There has been a sort of, populist opposition to it. And so I think, I remain hopeful that we're at such a moment. The conditions are there precisely because there's so little trust in these authorities. There's the conditions there to actually really get some real reform.
Well, I'll tell you what scares me is that to the extent that I'm seeing any of that, I'm seeing it on the right.
Yes, right. And I think that's
that's what's that's what's terrifying here is because I think we all thought, and speaking for myself, I thought, okay, this is that moment. Right. And that moment seems like it was 6 to 8 months ago. Right. And to the extent anybody who's come out of it, it's on the right. And it's because Democrats have been almost aggressively avoiding that populist movement, that we have ceded all that territory to the right to the point where people are taking teabaggers seriously. Yeah. And that, you combine that with this notion. And because the thing is that when that happens on the right, it mutates very quickly, underpinned by a nativism, a nationalism, a racism.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And that's become, I think
that's become what?
I'm sorry, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's become obscured a little bit precisely because there is at this kind of visceral, kind of precognitive level, a connection between the F it all, they're all corrupt feeling that you get from the Tea Partiers and from the mood of the country. And so what that does is that connection obscures the fact that the actual specifics of the worldview of a lot of these people is deeply, deeply, deeply screwed up and deeply reactionary, nativist, and racist, and all sorts of stuff. We all read that Daily Kos poll about what the belief systems of a lot of Republicans are, and that wasn't even the Tea Partiers, that was just the Republican Party. So there's something really dangerous about that.
This is very terrifying because 6 months ago, people were aware of those underpinnings. And now their message of it's all corrupt is resonating more than the foundations of where that message is coming from. And frankly, I'm a little nervous because what happens with these type of movements on the right is that this is what's so fascinating. You listen to Rush Limbaugh talking about this stuff. Rush Limbaugh at once can both support the Tea Partiers and support the Supreme Court's notion that corporations have the right to basically buy elections.
No, it's
and
amazing. And it's amazing how they can channel this populist energy. This is sort of Tom Frank 101, but channel populist energy in directions of entrenching the oligarchy in the most kind of bald-faced way. So, and part of what has to happen is the Democrats have to call that bluff more. Like they did, it's amazing they don't do it more, and partly because they're so captured themselves, particularly by financiers. But look at, this just small little, basically incremental bank tax. I mean, the bank tax would be like, it's nothing. It's like, for you or me, it would be like paying a quarter, basically.
Right.
So it's like, and even that, the banks go, crazy about A, and B, the Republicans won't sign on. Even Scott Brown, who's in a contested race, can't bring himself. So you have to call those bluffs a lot more, I think, because otherwise it gets co-opted.
That's the other thing that scares me is that Barack Obama goes up and makes this speech that makes the State of the Union address, and he doesn't even seem at this point, and he did this a little bit during the campaign, but he doesn't even seem at this point to pretend to be populist. I mean, the idea that
doesn't have a populist bone in his body.
The idea that he's faced with this situation, from a sort of a political standpoint, that he can't even express rhetorically, like, we didn't hear the word greedy.
Yeah. He said, the worst line of the speech was when he said, "I'm not interested in punishing the banks." And I tweeted, well, just for the record, I'm super interested in punishing the banks.
Yeah.
They screwed up and they engaged a lot of fraud and they immiserated a lot of people and they destroyed a tremendous amount of wealth. And so, if that's not worthy of punishment, then what's worthy of punishment? I mean, there are people in this country who get caught holding, a little cocaine for their abusive drug dealing boyfriend who end up doing a year in prison. They get punished. So,
what's very disturbing to me is that not only is he not interested in punishing the banks, he's not interested in saying he's interested in punishing the banks.
That's right. That's what's so crazy. I totally agree.
There seems to be a total disconnect coming out of the establishment of the Democratic Party as to what's going on in the country.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And part of it's a class thing. Part of it is the kind of blinders of your social networks. Part of it is the fact that they're captured, and part of it's the sort of, tactical decision that you can't bash these banks because then they're going to give money. I mean, look, that's a big part of it, right? Like, Democrats get a lot of money from Wall Street, and someone I know who works on Wall Street recounted a story to me of someone at his firm getting a call from a Democrat, from someone from the DNC trying to raise money, and the guy said to him, now keep in mind, all of us think that, I think rightly, that the White House has been far too easy on the banks, and yet the banks are still, at this point, ferociously pissed off at the White House. And this guy answered the call from the DNC and said, the president would have a better chance of raising money from the KKK than he would from our firm right now, and hung up the phone. And, I think it shows that, the banks are occupied by people that I think we can fairly call sociopathic. I mean, I really think that, at this point, the way that the banking elite has acted has been totally antisocial in, a clinical sense. and B, I was like, well, this is great, actually, because if Democratic donors find that their calls aren't being returned by the banks, if they get cut off financially, then maybe that will make them less captured, right?
Or maybe it'll make them go further to get that money.
That's exactly the tipping point. But at a certain point, they're caught right between the dollars and between getting the dollars and good politics. And what they're trying to do is have it both ways, and they're satisfying neither constituency. The banks are pissed off at them, and people feel like they've been. Every poll says that the administration has been too friendly to the banks. His recovery package has when you ask them who has it benefited the most, people voluntarily respond to banks, even when you don't give them a kind of multiple choice. So they're trying to have it both ways, and it hasn't worked at all. And so, at a certain point, they're not going to be able. You think they have to make the political calculation that taking this kind of sort of vacillating approach, where they try to get money from the banks, they do a soften them, they make a populist turn here and there, is not really getting them anything politically. And to the extent that the banks essentially break up with them and dump them, I think that might push them into the place they should be anyway.
Well, yeah, I guess one can only hope. Well, let me ask you something. I mean, because I want to let you check out of the supermarket. I don't want you to get caught without supplies for the weekend. But knowing that you do have that the street activist DNA in you, and your job is to observe this stuff too, to a certain extent. But I mean, how is it? And I don't, I'm trying to talk in a more general sense. Maybe it's somewhat personal, but at what point do you not get completely discouraged, or what is it that, I mean, you have a story at the end of your piece, which is a great story, I think, or parable. But how is it that you do not get discouraged by this process? Because, when I see Obama refusing to even pay lip service to populism and ceding this ground, the only thing I'm thinking is like Jared Diamond's collapse. These guys are in a gated community. They don't realize what's going on.
Yeah, look, I get discouraged a lot, but I think the fact that there's this long historical view, I think, helps because, the country's been in, I mean, look, the Southern segregationist order never looked like it was going to collapse, right? And the other thing is that, like, this is, I mean, not to get too philosophical here, but this is the Sisyphean task of the left always and everywhere in every society, is that you're always fighting the powers that be, you're always trying to make the hardest changes, you're always speaking up for the people that are most marginalized, and that's never easy work. The odds are always stacked against you. And so there has to be almost a kind of, now I'm getting super airy, but there has to be, I think, almost a kind of spiritual commitment to it. Otherwise, you really do, it's easy to kind of withdraw into this defeatism. So that's my perhaps not satisfying answer.
Well, I mean, that's as good as one as that I could come up with, frankly. And I'm going to let you go. I'm going to tell the peasant parable. But Chris Hayes, everybody really, honestly, pick up this piece. It really does capture, I think, what is at issue. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Sam, thank you, man, and it's wonderful to hear radio. I miss you.
Well, not technically on radio, but so to speak, audio-wise.
Exactly, your dulcet tones coming through a microphone.